Hi, all. Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. And the beginning lectures here, I just want to kind of talk about the history of anatomy and physiology, talk about kind of how the lectures that I prepare, how they are designed to get you to start thinking about a clinical setting, whether that be nursing or some other allied health field. So we do a lot of scenarios. You'll read about or uh, look at a lot of vitals of individuals. And then for the most part, the idea is to tie the major themes that we will find in anatomy and physiology back to clinical applications, scenarios, things like that, so you can answer them to the best of your ability. Okay, so let's get into that. Maybe we're talking about thermal regulation. Maybe we're talking about hormones. Maybe we're talking about the whole pathway of homeostasis and kind of temperature regulation. So we might be talking about the receptors on the skin that entice sweating, the receptors that are going to send signals to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus sending a signal to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland then changing the metabolic rate. Okay? And the reaction of kind of this process, and we'll talk about how the process works, but then also what happens when there is alterations to that process, whether that be due to a disorder, a disease, an ailment, something going on. Okay, and we'll come back and look at that. So first, let's kind of just throw out there a case study real quick so you can get an idea of what these look like, kind of how we go through them, and get an idea of what kind of thought process you might have while you're going through one. So if we look at something like the wildfire season in the Pacific Northwest, it's hot. Okay, we have a 28-year-old male firefighter. Okay, he collapses. He makes it to the hospital, the emergency room. When he gets to the emergency room, the clinical presentation is that he is disoriented, he's sweating profusely, he complains of dizziness and nausea. His vital signs, so we're going to go through vital signs a lot. You should definitely know how to convert, say, Celsius to Fahrenheit or Fahrenheit to Celsius. This is one thing that you'll often be working at different clinics, different situations. Some doctors like to use Celsius, some like to use Fahrenheit. And so just being able to convert is very valuable. So the individual comes in with a fever, okay, of 40.2 degrees Celsius. His heart rate is tachycardic, okay, 148 beats per minute. Blood pressure is 92 over 58, so he's hypotensive. Okay, respiratory rate shows that he's tachypneic, and 32 breaths per minute. Now, if you're not familiar with these, don't worry. As we progress through the course, we'll talk about tachycardia and hypo and hypertensiveness, etc. Oxygen saturation is 91% of the air. His level of consciousness, or LOC, is confused. He's disoriented. He's a GCS of about 13. Capillary refill is delayed. It's greater than 3 seconds. And his lab shows that he has elevated potassium levels, and there's evidence of muscle breakdown through rhabdomyolysis. Okay. So how does this pertain to the general themes of anatomy and physiology? Well, some of the major themes directly related to it. Of course, this patient is showing that his thermal regulation is not, it's not great. He's got a fever, so his internal temperature is higher than it should be. Okay? Some ways at which that can that internal temperature can go back down is by sweating. So you evaporative cooling, vasodilation, okay, and those are homeostasis feedback loops. Okay, too hot, okay, start sweating, dilating, etc. Right, gradients and flow. Right, electrolytes. Right, again, potassium balance is off. So if the potassium balance is off, it's probably a good sign that sodium balance is off also. Not directly measured in the labs, but again, this is electrolyte gradient. If it's disrupted, that can cause some major issues, and we'll talk about what kind of issues come about. But really, how material move across gradients is how uh, nerve impulses work, how muscle contractions and relaxation works. So disrupting those gradients can be problematic when it comes to things like that. We'll talk about the hierarchy of complexity. So a failure at cellular level, so such as these ion gradients, okay, that can cause an organ fail or organ system failure, because you can have these cellular levels not have enough sodium or potassium, so the channels, the gates don't open, and your nerve impulses don't work. So now you have a nervous system impairment. Well, if your nervous system impairment doesn't is your nervous system isn't working, that can cause a cardiovascular collapse. And so you have these connections, these hierarchy of complexity from the cellular level all the way to the organ or system level. The form and function. So we often talk about form and function. Okay? Well, in this case, protective gear, its function is to protect the individual from outside sources. Okay? Fire, wind, hot, ambers, etc. So, but because that protective layer is so thick, it also limits the evaporative cooling function of the body. So you can get some structure, in this case, the anatomy or the protective gear, okay, and the physiology and the function of evaporative cooling. And you can have these two things are kind of at ends. Hey, and then kind of in general, we always like to tie this back to, career paths, so whether that be forensics, nursing. Okay, there's lots of other career paths that might have to do with these major themes in anatomy and physiology, and we try to tie those back to those kind of career paths. And so in the case of nursing and physician assistants, maybe they're interested in restoring homeostasis through IV use, and get those electrolytes balanced, uh, increase the amount of water that's in the system. Maybe a respiratory therapist is monitoring the oxygen delivery, and trying to stabilize the cardiovascular system. So there's these interactions. We'll talk about radiology when they might play a role on things like, control systems where maybe you have internal features that are breaking down, or maybe you have broken bones or torn ligaments and things like that. And then we'll talk about some other kind of industries or other pathways like forensics, where maybe the individual has passed, and then we have to figure out kind of, well, what might have been the cause. Was it heat exertion? Did the individual have a heat stroke or something like that? And so we can kind of get an idea from those kind of things. Okay. Well, before we get into all that, we need to talk in general about anatomy and physiology. So first off, anatomy is the study of structures. Okay. So it's the actual, just the name, the placement of the different structures, whether that be all the bones, all the muscles, okay, all the organs, the tissue layers, okay, that's all anatomy. Physiology is the function of those. Okay? Majority of anatomy and physiology. One is anatomy. Yes, we'll talk about physiology, but you have to learn the anatomy first and the names and how kind of the structures work together before we can get into the actual physiology, the actual function. We'll talk about some function, but a lot of it's going to be structure based. Okay? And the great thing about anatomy and physiology is once you've learned one, the other one is complementary. Okay? So if you know the anatomy, the physiology is complementary to it. You can't have one without the other. Right? And so we often will say physiology provides the meaning to the anatomy. It's okay to know the name of the bone, but what's its function? Okay. That's important. Or know the name of the muscle. What's its function? Okay. These kind of things are important. Okay. Way to examine the structure of the body. Okay. Well, there's lots of ways at which we can describe the form or the structure of the human body, and we'll cover many of these in lab. So you can just do inspection, look, appearance. Okay, you're going to do this with different bones, muscles, okay, different regions, systems of the body. Palpation, you can feel it with your hands. Okay, you can do oscillations. Okay, listen to the different sounds the body makes. And so when we get into the cardiac cycle and whatnot, you'll want to be able to do that. Percussions, you can tap on the body, you can feel the resistance. You can listen for oscillations and percussion at the same time, so you can listen for the emitted sound or abnormalities. Dissection, we'll do dissection. Okay, so we'll cover, the actual structures after you've removed them and dissected it, to look at, what might be the ailment or just general function, general anatomy of that structure. Comparative anatomy, I'll talk a lot about different species and maybe kind of the evolution of that structure. I find, if you can tie it to things that you're familiar with, then it's a lot easier to learn kind of form and function if you know, oh, that's how it works in this organism and that's why it works in us. And so I'll talk quite a bit about comparative anatomy. And then, of course, the past, we learned a lot from things like exploratory surgery. Okay, in the 1800s, 1700s, and even before that, a lot of the surgery that was done was exploratory because there was no medical imaging. And so that exploratory piece has really been replaced with medical imaging, and the medical imaging just keeps getting better and better, so there's really no need for that exploratory surgery, although we'll talk about individuals that did that. Okay, and of course that medical imaging is really related to radiology, which is kind of that branch of medicine. Okay, subdisciplines of anatomy. There's quite a few. So you have gross anatomy, that's the structures that can be seen with the naked eye. You have histology, this is microscopic anatomy. Okay, so this is the examination of tissues or cell types that are related to often these structures. Okay, histopathology is the examination of diseases of those tissues. Cytology is the actual cell, and normally looking at the cell from a electron microscope perspective. Okay? So maybe you're looking at the membranes of the cell, what proteins might be around, what kind of gated channels might be around. So the ultra fine details. Physiology. All right, there's quite a few subdisciplines of physiology. You have neurophysiology, where you're looking at the function of the nervous system. Endocrinology, where you're looking at the hormones and the function of hormones. Pathophysiology, the mechanisms of disease. Right? And then, of course, comparative physiology, where you might be looking at how different species, how their body functions a little bit differently. So maybe the anatomy is very similar, but the function of that anatomy is different. Okay? And that really allows for us to learn a lot more about human physiology when we understand how, you know, organisms that we might be related to, like the great apes, chimpanzees, and gorillas and orangutans, how their physiology works. Or instead of, testing humans, maybe we're testing drugs or procedures on mice and rats and pigs, and then we can get an idea of maybe how that might affect humans um, when it comes, to the drug or the procedure. All right, so real quick, let's fly through some of the individuals that kind of laid the groundwork for anatomy and physiology. Now, some of them more so than others, some of them had just a slight role, but all the individuals I'm going to kind of present kind of had at least some aspects that kind of paved a little bit of the way. Some maybe we could have done without, and probably got to the point where we're at, but nonetheless, some of them are important. So Hippocrates, he's known as the father of medicine. Okay, and the Hippocratic oath is where this kind of comes from, the code of ethics. Okay, that physicians often, we talk about that the Hippocratic oath, or the idea of do no harm. Okay, so that's kind of the idea that Hippocrates came up with. Aristotle, of course, he's famous for lots of fields of science, and his role that he played on kind of paving the way of things like physics and explaining as much about the planets and the atmosphere as possible. But nonetheless, he had some ideas that kind of it directed us to look at them, but maybe we could have done without the supernatural causes of diseases and things like that. So he kind of believed on both cases, that there was a physical cause, but then if the physical cause, if it wasn't known, like bacteria, viruses, because you couldn't see these things, then it was considered a supernatural cause. Yeah, so lots of other things that are associated with. He really was interested in diseases and whatnot. And so if it's supernatural, he'd call it the disease theology. Okay, if it was a natural cause that he knew, like a poison or a bite from an insect or something like that, then it was physiology or physiology, GE, or I, sorry. And that's really where those kind of terms came from: physician, physiology, um, and yeah, really his role in science was great, even though he brought a lot of supernatural explanations into the field of anatomy and physiology. Okay, Metrodora, first female to publish a medical textbook. Okay, Herophilius is known as a father of anatomy. Really did a lot of work, um, and there's some definite ethical issues with Herophilius' work. So the idea was that he would use living criminals and do vivid dissections, live dissections of these individuals. And that's how he found out a lot of the systems that he was working on. Um, so he'd make a big display of it also, and so individuals would come from all over to watch him do dissections of these criminals, and so like peeling the skin off of an individual while they're alive and whatnot, and so a lot of kind of major ethical issues going on, but learned a lot from his dissections, learned a lot about the human body, learned the connections from the human body to other organisms. It wasn't just dissections of criminals, he dissected other things. Okay, Claudius of Galen, he was a physician of gladiators, so he got to see a lot of wounds. Cadaver use was banned in Rome, and so you couldn't dissect uh, cadavers or individuals that had um, died from these fights, but he got to see a lot of wounds of the individuals, and so as long as they were, still alive, he could document what he saw. Um, let's see. Uh, After that period of time, we get into kind of modern Western medicine, and you start to see anatomy and physiology be a science. So, really, I would say that you start to see documentation from more scientific documentation. And I would say that Andreas Vesalius was the first to kind of do that. And so his Atlas of Anatomy that was published in 1543, it was really about that, was about being anatomically correct. No, uh, not exaggerating body parts and things like that. And so his explanations were very scientific. And yeah, so I would say that he is kind of the first to start the scientific process um, with dissection, with anatomy. Harvey, on the other hand, was really kind of the first to look at experimental physiology. So between kind of Andreas Vesalius and William Harvey, you had the anatomy and physiology kind of being, from a scientific perspective, being put together. Right? And so Harvey used Andreas Vesalius's work to base his physiology on it, and so he wrote on the motion of the heart, okay, where he was trying to figure out the flow of blood. Okay, so prior to really this time period, the early 1600s, a lot of individuals thought the liver was what pushed blood, and that the liver was basically the main system where blood was being pumped by the liver. And in fact, it wasn't a cycle. They thought that the blood was pumped and then the blood was consumed and new blood was being made, and that it wasn't being cycled around. And so Harvey's work really was initially the work that showed that the heart flows from the heart and then back to the heart. And we'll talk more about this, obviously, as we progress. Okay, and then came what many would consider kind of the birth of modern medicine. This really was going from these anatomy and physiology of structures where it wasn't a guess, but it was less scientific even Harvey's research was less scientific than Marcello or Malpai's work. He finished up Harvey's work, and because he started to examine, well, yes, the blood is pumped out of the heart to the body, returns to the heart, but there's other things that are going on. Like, are there cells? There capillaries? There, what's kind of the interaction between these things? And so he was able to use microscopes to analyze what's actually moving and where is it moving through. Okay? And Robert Hooke, his role was really in developing microscopes. Okay? So Robert Hooke, some of you who might have taken, a beginning bio class, probably have heard of his name. He's the individual that came up with the name cells. He's considered the first person to ever see a cell, and that was a plant cell. But he designed and made improvements to the very first compound microscopes so that Malpai could actually examine blood cells and capillary beds, etc. And so his work was really important for kind of paving the way for that modern medicine, that modern look at what's actually being flowing through the veins, what's actually moving um, in the cardiovascular system. Okay? And then I would say that after kind of you have Hooke, who paved the way for examining cells and microscope work, then you have like individuals like Antoine von Leeuwenhoek, who made even better microscopes and whatnot. And then you have individuals like Schleiden and Schwann, who started to come up with the cell theory, in that all organisms are composed of cells. Okay? Cells are the smallest unit of life. And so these individuals started looking at all organisms and trying to connect the cellular aspect to the tissue level aspect, to the organ level aspect, and on. And then, of course, Louis Pasteur, who's pictured here, he's really important for kind of modern medicine and paving the way to examine diseases. Okay, and so he came up with the theory of disease, or the germ theory of disease, by discovering bacteria and its role in contaminating things like liquid broths and other things. So before Louis Pasteur's work, we thought that, if, say, flies or if maggots were growing on meat, that it was spontaneous generation. And Louis Pasteur's work showed that no, in fact, it's, flies laid eggs there and then they hatched. Or if bread molds over time, mold spores got on that, and then the bread molds over time. Same thing with what's being pictured here is his famous flask experiment, where he had nutrient broth in two different flasks, one that had kind of this tail on it, so bacteria could enter here, but it couldn't climb up the tail and get into the flask. And then the other one, which I guess you can see them here, they've been broken off. And so bacteria and the air from the room could go into the flask, and then the bacteria would get in there and grow. And that's really the third tenet of the cell theory. So the first two tenets came from Schleiden and Schwann. All organisms are composed of cells, and cells are the smallest unit of life. And then the last tenet would be the third tenet of the cell theory, is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. Okay.